May 8th, 1945, a date etched in the annals of history as the day silence descended upon the ravaged battlefields of Europe, the day the guns finally ceased their mournful dirge. Yet the proclamation of peace, the triumphant peal of victory, masked a more complex reality, a labyrinthine web of surrenders, negotiations and lingering shadows. The official surrender of a shattered regime represents not a single, definitive moment, but rather a culmination, a series of acts played out under the pall of defeat. It began not with flags waving and crowds cheering, but with a single stark act of self-destruction deep beneath the ruins of Berlin. The architect of unimaginable suffering, the man who had plunged a continent into darkness, took his own life in the confines of his underground bunker, a squalid end to a reign of terror. His demise, however, did not immediately extinguish the flames of conflict. Power, in a grotesque parody of succession, passed to two figures as disparate as they were desperate. First, Dr. Joseph, a master of deception, the twisted voice of the regime, now briefly elevated to the position of Chancellor. Second, Grand Admiral Karl, commander of the rapidly diminishing naval forces, a pragmatist clinging to the remnants of a shattered navy. One, entombed within the crumbling capital, sought a fleeting chance at negotiation. The other, situated in the north, wrestled with the grim realities of a collapsing front line. The former, the propaganda minister, made a desperate plea to the advancing Soviet forces, an offer of ceasefire from a nation teetering on the brink. It was a futile gesture. The Soviets, their resolve hardened by years of brutal conflict, demanded nothing less than unconditional surrender. His reign, measured in hours, ended as abruptly as it began, a final horrific act of allegiance to a lost cause, taking his own life and that of his family. The next day, Berlin, a city reduced to rubble and ash, finally yielded, its surrender a symbolic but practically limited event, failing to halt the broader decline elsewhere. The state of affairs across the continent was a patchwork of capitulation and resistance. In territories untouched by recent combat, garrisons of troops remained, isolated and awaiting orders, their presence a mere formality. Consider the occupied Channel Islands, or the ruined port cities of France like Dunkirk, silent sentinels of a forgotten dominion. Massive contingents still held sway in Denmark and Norway, territories strategically important yet largely removed from the immediate theatre of war. Meanwhile, a chaotic tide of soldiers surged westward, defying commands, driven by a primal fear of the advancing Soviet forces. They sought refuge, desperately hoping to surrender to British or American forces, clinging to the slim possibility of a less brutal captivity. Their actions, however understandable, served to further complicate the already precarious situation. This mass movement angered the Soviet leadership. With Allied agreements focused on unconditional surrender, these fragmented surrenders were a point of contention and suspicion. Elsewhere, pockets of fanatical resistance clung tenaciously to their positions. In the east, especially, units fought with desperate fury, determined to delay the inevitable at any cost. Areas southwest of Prague, north of Berlin, and portions of Austria and Yugoslavia became scenes of intense, bloody clashes. These were not merely rearguard actions, but desperate attempts to hold back the relentless tide of the Red Army. The Western Allies, too, faced continued, although often less intense, resistance. Despite the meeting of American and Soviet forces at Torgau on the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, effectively bisecting the nation, the remnants of the once formidable army continued to fight, their efforts a grim testament to the lingering poison of indoctrination. This division of the country led to an operational split. Field Marshal Albert assumed command in the south, while Grand Admiral in the north controlled forces in northwestern Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway, holding his position of leader as designated by the dead dictator, announced by radio, The war was to continue. He was fully aware of the nation's hopeless situation, understood the futility of further military resistance, yet he was driven by a singular purpose: Operation Hannibal. This was a massive, desperate undertaking, the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of German troops and civilians from the Baltic territories, a region threatened by the imminent arrival of Soviet forces. He feared the stories of atrocities that preceded them. Had been shown Allied plans for post-war division. These plans demarcated future zones. Thus he resolved to maximise the number of soldiers surrendering to Western forces, even if it meant a tactical delay. This tactic would provide time for more civilians and soldiers to escape, ensuring, at least in his mind, that some would be spared the horrors he imagined. This calculated strategy, a cynical manipulation of the surrender process, would have profound implications for the shape of the post-war world, sowing the seeds of future distrust and division. The British 21st Army Group, a formidable force spearheaded by tanks and infantry, advanced relentlessly through the weakened defences of northern Germany. They were a juggernaut of steel and manpower, pushing inexorably towards the Danish border. On May 3, 1945, dispatched a delegation, led by Admiral Von, to the British Second Army headquarters at Villa. With him were Rear Admiral Gerhard Wagner, a key strategist, and General Eberhard, representing Field Marshal Ernst Busch, whose Army Group Northwest bore the brunt of the fighting against the British and Canadian forces. They were driven to Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters, a collection of command caravans situated on the desolate expanse of Lüneburg Heath. Montgomery, ever the theatrical commander, known for his meticulous planning and his penchant for self-promotion, kept the German delegation waiting. They stood beneath the stark flagpole, the British Union Jack snapping in the wind. The delay was deliberate, a calculated psychological manoeuvre intended to underscore the power dynamic. Finally he emerged from his caravan, his bearing radiating an almost palpable aura of authority. Crisp uniform, polished boots, and that unwavering gaze. "Who are these men?" he barked at an interpreter, his voice carrying that distinctive nasal tone. Upon hearing their names and ranks, he retorted dismissively, "I've never heard of them. What do they want?" A letter was produced, a formal communication from Field Marshal Wilhelm, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. Offered the surrender of Army Group Vistula, a contingent of roughly 500,000 troops still engaged in fierce combat north of Berlin, on the condition that they be taken prisoner by the British. Montgomery, however, rejected the proposal outright, pointing out rather coldly that Army Group Vistula was operating within the Soviet zone of influence, and therefore their surrender was a matter for the Soviets to decide. He did say that he could only entertain the surrender of German forces on his own northern and western flanks. He meant those in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark. A tense silence hung in the air. The Germans, confronted with Montgomery's unwavering stance, were clearly taken aback. A lunch, rather a lavish affair considering the circumstances, was served, a calculated attempt to allow the Germans time to consider Montgomery's offer. The gesture of hospitality, however, was a thin veneer masking the underlying power struggle. After lunch, a second meeting was convened inside Montgomery's command tent, the air thick with anticipation. Von stated that he lacked the authority to negotiate such a comprehensive surrender. He proposed a return to Grand Admiral's headquarters at the Academy Inn to discuss the matter further. Montgomery, after a brief consultation with his staff, agreed. This would allow him to speak to the German leader, but it meant the delay would allow continued enemy action. A British officer, Major Richard O'Brien, along with an escort, accompanied Von Toe's headquarters. The journey back through the British lines was a surreal experience. They passed through areas recently contested, the landscape scarred by shell craters and the detritus of war. On the afternoon of May 4th, Von's party returned, escorted back to Montgomery's headquarters. The Field Marshal, sensing a breakthrough, immediately called a press conference. eager to capitalize on the moment. He briefed the assembled journalists, carefully controlling the narrative, ensuring that the story aligned with his own self-image. The photographs would be useful for the folks back home, demonstrating the strength and precision of the war effort. After briefing the press, he had the German officers parade once more in front of the Union flag, a symbolic act, a visual representation of their defeat. This done, Montgomery led Von into his caravan. He asked him privately if he was prepared to sign the surrender document. Von, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. The entire German delegation then entered Montgomery's large tent, the atmosphere heavy with tension and anticipation. At 6:30 p.m., they signed the instrument of surrender, a document that would come into force at 8 o'clock British time on the morning of May 5, 1945. A small victory for the Allies, but the battle to end the war and rebuild the peace was still far from over. While the surrender of German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway represented a significant step towards peace, the war continued elsewhere, and government remained in existence. At Prime Minister Churchill's insistence, was left in control of a substantial area of northern Germany near the Danish border, with thousands of troops still under arms, and with the likes of Reich leader SS Heinrich Himmler lurking in the shadows. Churchill reasoned that government would be better placed to manage the surrender and disarmament of German forces, saving the British the considerable effort, an approach leaving a government in existence until May 23, 1945, long after VE Day. The next order, Von to negotiate the partial surrender of forces still fighting the Americans, a move that would enable to surrender in the West while prolonging the war in the East. This was intended to prevent the Soviets from gaining more territory in Europe and to continue Operation Hannibal. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was deeply concerned that local surrenders, such as that negotiated by Montgomery with Von, would damage the Western Allies' relationship with the USSR. Unconditional German surrender to all Allied powers had long been agreed upon. These fractured surrenders undermined the strength of Allied cooperation. Therefore, Eisenhower informed General Alexei Antonov of the Soviet High Command and promised that he would press the Germans for complete unconditional surrender on all fronts, including the Eastern Front. A Soviet delegation, led by Major General Ivan, was dispatched to participate in the negotiations, ensuring Eisenhower kept his word. On May 5, 1945, Von attempted to fly to Allied headquarters at a city the Americans called Reims in World War II to meet Eisenhower, but his aircraft was diverted to British-occupied Brussels due to bad weather. The Germans were then driven 200 kilometres by the British to the meeting at the Reims Technical College. There they met General Walter, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Von told Smith that the Germans were prepared to surrender forces on the Western Front. Smith informed Eisenhower, who insisted the surrender be unconditional on all fronts. Eisenhower also threatened to cease accepting fleeing German prisoners into Western Allied lines, meaning the thousands who daily were leaving soon-to-be Soviet territory for US and British occupation areas. He would simply close the borders and leave them to the Soviets. Von sent a signal to for his advice, tried a different approach. Colonel General Alfred, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command, flew to Reims to assist in negotiations with General Smith, arriving on May 6, 1945, explained that only surrender in the West was acceptable to the German government. Smith informed Eisenhower that he believed was stalling for time, which he was. Eisenhower demanded unconditional surrender, or he would halt any further negotiations, sent a signal to this effect to who gave his permission to surrender early on May 7th. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, General signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces in a large packed room at Reims Technical College. Eisenhower remained in a separate room. General Smith, British Admiral Sir Harold, and Soviet General also signed, along with French General. The agreement would come into force at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time the next day, May 8, 1945, giving the Germans a period of grace. The Germans were escorted from the room, and the Allied representatives celebrated with champagne drunk from mess tins. Eisenhower then met German Major Wilhelm's aide in his office. In a cold voice, he asked them if they understood the surrender terms. When they replied that they did, Eisenhower asked if they were prepared to carry them out. They agreed, bowed slightly and left the room. The Germans now had 45 hours to complete Operation Hannibal. The last convoy left now in western Latvia on May 8, 1945, shortly before the surrender became law, carrying 15,000 German soldiers and civilians. In total, Operation Hannibal saw the successful evacuation of almost 2 million troops and refugees. The problem now was the Soviets had signed the surrender document only on the agreement that if Stalin required a further signing ceremony, they would have to take part. The British, Americans and French agreed to his terms. Unsurprisingly, Stalin did indeed want such a ceremony to take place, demanding a ratification of the ceremony at Reims to be staged in Soviet territory, and where better than the destroyed capital of the Reich, Berlin, then deep inside the Soviet occupation area? The Soviet headquarters in devastated Berlin had been established by Marshal Georgy, the victor of Stalingrad, in the less damaged suburb of Karlshorst, the site of the captured German Army Engineering School. A third German surrender was planned for May 8, 1945, another grim chapter in the saga of defeat. Eisenhower would once again not attend in person, sending his deputy as Supreme Allied Commander, British Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur, senior Allied representative along with US General Karl, British Admiral Sir Harold and French General Jean. The Soviets also demanded the most senior German officers appear to sign the document, those with the government. In accordance with Soviet wishes, Field Marshal, representing the Army, Admiral von, representing the Navy, and Colonel General Stumpf, representing the Luftwaffe, were flown by US aircraft to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. These were men chosen for their position, rather than any sense of honour. Soviet vehicles then transported the 3 senior officers and their aides to the Army Engineering School at Karlshorst, a grim procession through the ruins of a fallen empire. Soviet Marshal, the victor of Berlin, would represent the USSR. Over food and vodka, the formalities were agreed. Air Chief Marshal would sign both as Eisenhower's deputy and as British representative, would sign for the Soviet Union, General for the US, and D for France. A tableau of victorious powers. A delay was caused by the translation of the surrender document into Russian, the gears of bureaucracy turning even amidst the wreckage of war. Finally, the meeting was opened in the early hours of May 9th, 1945, the German surrender having already occurred at 11:03 p.m. on May 8th, 1945. The events were mere formalities. When ordered the German representatives to enter the room, they did so as representatives of a nation that had already surrendered. Their actions carried no strategic consequence. The 3 German generals entered with their aides, Field Marshal casting baleful glares at the Allied representatives. A mad crash of Allied reporters and photographers threatened to turn the entire event into a circus, and in particular looked extremely annoyed. Monocle grinding into his left eye, none of his old arrogance diminished by his present situation. He, like the rest of them, were simply puppets. The 3 Germans each signed by 12:20 a.m. on May 9th. Then the Allied representatives signed, with French general signing last. It was over. The war in Europe was ended, although the cost of that freedom will remain in the shadows forever. The Germans were ordered from the room, their roles in this drama complete. The German delegates to the 3 surrender ceremonies met differing fates, each testament to the brutality and finality of defeat. Admiral von was arrested by British forces when the government was dissolved on Churchill's order on May 23, 1945. He committed suicide the same day, using a cyanide capsule, an end as bleak as the path he had chosen. Field Marshal and Colonel General were both arraigned before the Nuremberg Tribunal and found guilty. They were both hanged in 1946. Their lives